Thank you everybody for coming tonight. My name is Mark Becker. I teach history here and I'm the chair of the Global Issues Colloquium. We've been doing this for 15 years now or so to bring global issues to the Truman campus. We have lectures about once a month. If you came in late like Krista, you can grab a flyer unless I'm on the chair there on the way out for our next colloquium. A month from today, we're very fortunate to have the renowned economist Richard Wolff. This is going to be a big talk, and so normally we meet here, but we're moving to Violet Hall 1000 for next month because we'll probably have a bigger audience. So, like I said, I gave most of you the flyer when you came in. There's more at the door that you can grab on your way out. For tonight, though, we are very fortunate to have John James Quinn, professor of political science here at Truman State University. He's been here since 1996. He has a major in history and English and a PhD and master's degree from UCLA. He teaches African politics, comparative politics, international political economy, research methodology, introduction to political science, introduction to international relations, and senior seminar. He's also taught at the University of Ghana in Legon, and he spent 3 years as a Peace Corps volunteer in Zaire, also known as the Congo. So if you're interested in going into the Peace Corps, Dr. Quinn is one of our key people here at Truman to talk to about that. He's published a series of books and articles on African politics. His most recent book, which is the basis of his talk tonight, is Global Geopolitical Power in the African Political and Economic Institutions When Elephants Fight. And I think without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Quinn. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, welcome. Thanks for coming out tonight. Can you all hear me? Okay. Thanks for braving what might be thunderstorms. I heard thunder like an hour or so ago. And as Dr. Becker remarked, the title of the book is Global Geopolitical Power in African Political and Economic Institutions. It came out last year with Lexington Books. And inside it starts with a Swahili proverb, Tembo zikipigana ulianyasi. When elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers. And how that sort of fits this book is not so much Africa suffering per se, but it's the idea of weaker states having to respond whenever there's a major shift in international power. And let's all try to flesh part of this out. And the first one is, of course, global issues colloquium. Okay, so African political and economic institutions isn't usually a lead story, but they are the primary venues of the distribution of economic and political power, and they're the debate of many long-standing ideological contention, and I believe that they're a reflection of both intellectual, ideological, as well as material power. And depending who wields it and what people think is true or likely to be true or moral or likely to be moral shapes how people pursue power, how they dispense power, and how they interact with power. Okay, so the scholars in sub-Saharan Africa have widely recognized two massive shifts in African political and economic institutions, and they've been associated with, let's read on. So, and these have even been called the first and second waves of liberation. The first shift, or the first wave of liberation, politically, well, this was the decolonization of sub-Saharan Africa following World War II, when most of sub-Saharan Africa got carved up at the Berlin Conference in 1884/5, mostly between the British and the French, but also the Portuguese and the Spanish, and the Germans, although they lost the colonies after World War I. And between 57 and 66, most became independent. Not all, but most. Now, historically speaking, that's relatively quick. Historically speaking, sometimes eras last much longer. The result, although the departing colonial system suddenly discovered the merits of democracy, left behind parliamentary systems, These generally collapsed within 5 to 10 years after colonial powers left. And the new normal for sub-Saharan Africa were no party states. And I take this from Ruth Collier's categorization. A one-party state is where one party holds 100% of the seats, and no party, there are no seats at all. And usually that's the main method under military rule. Only 3 countries had multi-party elections based loosely upon the quickly bequeathed political systems, and these were Botswana, the Gambia, and Mauritius. And these are, those of you that know Africa, these are small former British colonies, but still, they maintained it. Although the Gambia didn't have an army until 1990, and then they had a coup like December '94, and that person just finally left power like a couple weeks ago. Okay, economically, there was a move away from European control. Of course, it was colonial, European control of wealth and power, and it resulted in the transfer to really the control of the political elites of the region. How did this form of consolidation of power take place? Well, first, inward-oriented development policies. And these are policies which are created primarily to tilt production in the favor of the domestic market. Secondly, import substitution industrialization. At the time, most people thought rapid and quick development required industrialization. And nationalization of international mining, oil, and some industrial sectors, mostly multinational corporations or transnational corporations. And in addition, nationalization, indigenization, and Africanization. So nationalization is transfer from foreigners to the state. Indigenization is transfer from foreigners to locals, host nationals. And Africanization or transfer of jobs from foreigners to nationals. And what a lot of these have in common is they nicely dovetailed for the political elites in fulfilling standards of fairness, but it also dovetailed nicely because it helped reinforce their political power. Think of, think of like a party machine. The more economic resources you can distribute through your political machine, the more reinforcing it is. The second shift, politically, there was a relatively rapid, again, historically speaking, movement away from military/one-party regimes to multi-party regimes. Nearly every country in the subcontinent, and if I didn't mention this before, this is sub-Saharan Africa, the subcontinent changed from one-party systems to de jure multi-party regimes, meaning in law. And but what emerged were predominantly one-party dominant regimes, where the ruling elite tended to have a majority or a supermajority. Okay, economically, the second shift was associated with partial political liberalization of the prior systems of inward-oriented development policy. So financial reforms were the most complete. Van der Waal makes a very good case of this in his political economy book in sub-Saharan Africa. And he also points out these are the ones that are most reversible, right? That the government, the stroke of a pen, can reinstitute many of these policies. And there was some privatization, but my read on it, it was a slow, reluctant, rearguard action. And we'll get into the reasons for that. And even to now, most large mining, exporting sectors, large oil exporting sectors remain majority state-owned. And large firms with lots of employment, because that would have negative political consequences for people in power. Now, how to explain this? I suggest that part of the reason to understand these changes go to prior geopolitical shifts, which are associated with changes in interstate actors who wield power. And the argument is that different actors who are wielding power are likely to have different foreign policy views and views on how the international community ought to be run. Now, for liberals, they're like, yeah. For realists, they're like, no, doesn't matter, right? If you're a powerful state, you will pursue similar self-interest regardless of your regime, regardless of prior alliances and so forth. However, you know, imagine if fascist Germany and Japan had won World War II, or had not lost. The international trading system would not have emerged. And international leadership, I argue, requires both material resources to attract allies as well as an ideological legitimacy. It's both material and ideological perspective. There's a whole literature called hegemonic stability theory, and they kind of sort of do, when a hegemon comes in, they set into place the regimes they want. They kind of ignore the cost of that. And they kind of ignore, oftentimes, the soft power that Joseph Nye, who come along later, would make famous in international relations. So, therefore, if there are costs in doing these, the leaders, or would-be leaders, because there's contention in the international system, who should run, or whose model should prevail, do not do without a cost. And so they, international leaders, often offer both carrots and sticks in order to get people either to join their alliance or condone it. And condoning, properly understood, means not opposing, not actively opposing, okay, Russia. And according to Kindleberger, who was one of the earlier thinkers of hegemonic stability theory, that the large economic power creates public goods. And in this case, in the first shift, it would be the United States, at least in the Western world, freedom of the seas, free trade, but we'll get into that. I'm getting ahead of my own story here. So, when a rapid shift takes place in geopolitical power, also lessons are learned. So not only are there ideas that matter in sort of a Gramscian sense, that there are ideas that the powerful want to push through and have other people understand, like an idea of hegemony, but also ideas can matter that historians look at quick changes and say, well, this happened because of this, and this happened because of that. And we have to react to the new military world in response. And think about all the analysis. Anton and I were talking about this reason. He was making the point, if Hillary had won, all the lessons that would be drawn right now versus having Trump having won, and all the lessons that are being learned, I suggest this happens at the geopolitical level as well, right? So people go through what caused the losers to lose, what caused the victors to win, and what formerly acceptable ideas are now not, and which formerly unacceptable ideas are. And then again, depending on whether you're a powerful state, a weak state, or in the middle state, should you ally? How do you respond to it? All of a sudden, a new power structure. You don't know exactly how it's going to play out. You have to think proactively as well as retrospectively. Okay, so another assumption behind this work, because rational choice can't be completely missing, even though I say ideas matter, that African leaders' primary interest is to stay in power, the African elites. They are from weak states, and that unlike realist assumptions, and if you go to Christopher Clapham in his book on African International Relations makes this point abundantly clear in my opinion, that African leaders maximize resources domestically, internationally, and regionally as a way of parlaying their power. So if you think of the medieval period with barons playing against kings, playing against others, that it's actually a multi-stage game of people trying to keep their place. And that these leaders have to adjust to these rapid changes and opportunities, and they are. Constraints and opportunities. And also, these shifts are associated with changes of ideas, as I mentioned before. And a lot of this happens, especially for rapid geopolitical change, and the only two I examined were relatively rapid, that it creates, if you know policy, essentially a policy window opens, in which new institutions could be created, or the direction of institutions could be changed, or new ways of thinking present themselves, whereas if you have a slow, methodical change, it's harder to get this done. So like Peter Hall, for example, his book on institutions talks about how Keynesianism could come in and like sweep through, but once in, like the Washington Consensus had to fight established people already in there, okay? And there wasn't a geopolitical shift for that. Also, ideas can be normative, moral, or instrumental. or may simply reflect learning or innovation. Okay. So let's move away a little bit from the theory stuff then. So what we know is the world was multipolar, leading up to the traditional realist world. Great states aligning or breaking alliances depending on power, availability, suspicions, relationships. And then a bipolar world emerged with the United States, the leadership of the West, as you know, and Latin America, Western Europe and Latin America, and the USSR, and within its sphere of influence, and elsewhere was contested. Europe was devastated. Most European nations that had taken part in the war, including the Soviet Union / Russia, had a tremendous time, a tremendous burden of rebuilding itself, rebuilding its cities, its populations, its infrastructure, its economy, its industry. The United States, with the exception of Pearl Harbor and one Aleutian Island, was untouched, right? And our entire industrial capacity was in place. Also, the Europeans were trying to reestablish, especially the French and the British, were toying with the idea, and the Dutch as well, trying to reestablish their colonies. And the French learned, through blood and treasure, that this didn't go well in Vietnam. And it went even less well in Algeria. And the Dutch tried to retake Indonesia after the war. And this didn't turn out well for them, in part because of American pressure. And also, the United States, as you know, occupied Japan, occupied Western Germany. So we had disproportionate say in what they wanted and what was going to go on in their foreign policies. And France and the UK were aligned with us, at least, if not a hard alliance with the French, at least a soft alliance. Okay? So the United States had strong preferences for free trade, democracy, and national self-determination. Wilson and before. We had long been opposed to colonization, both out of principle and self-interest. Free colonization locked Americans out of other markets. Okay? The World Bank, the IMF, and GATT were established at Bretton Woods in New Hampshire, which helped create the institution. So think a little bit of Keynes, that you have to manage the market a little bit. And some of the learning from what happened in World War I with the competitive devaluations of currencies, which were going to affect economic warfare, or could be seen as such. Think about the difficulty of trade when every country has a different currency, and the coordination issues you have with which states would trade and under what conditions. These three institutions were created to help solve, manage, and deepen international trade. During the war, the United States made England sign the Atlantic Charter. It was during Lend-Lease, you know about Lend-Lease? We were technically neutral in World War II, but we decided we'd lend the British battleships. They could get back after the war, and then lease them. But in return, they had to sign the Atlantic Charter, which within it had normative claims for free trade in raw materials and national self-determination. Now, after the war, Churchill was like, whoa, we meant Europe. We didn't mean Africa and Asia. And Roosevelt was like, we meant it all. Right? And Truman held that position as well. Also, the European coal, European community for coal and steel, and rising European integration. Some of the lessons from World War II was that this mercantilist competition for raw materials led to 2 world wars. And if we want to avoid a 3rd world war, countries should be able to develop and obtain resources on a free trade basis from the world. And so part of this, and also the primary rivalries over steel and iron between Germany and France helped get solved here. Okay, so having just said the United States was all about free trade and democracy, there was a Cold War thing. And so all of a sudden the priorities shifted. So on the one hand, yes, we want democracy, we want free trade, but definitely, absolutely don't become communist, right? And so communism became the containment, anti-communist Cold War became a primary foreign policy goal, and democracy and free trade became secondary, but they didn't disappear. And towards this, the United States actually pushed their allies to rapidly decolonize their colonies. Why? Part was Cold War logic. They didn't want a rising leadership to join with the Soviets, and they didn't want guerrilla warfare setting up and radicalization. Okay. And the United States, as leader of NAFTA, as dispenser of Marshall Fund money, as its disproportionate money, its influence rather, in Bretton Woods institutions, which I mentioned earlier, and a roaring economy gave it a lot of influence over its allies to help facilitate this. Where the U.S. didn't push were in white settler colonies, or where the likely inheritors were straight up communists, like in Vietnam. Okay, so what ideas changed in this period? Well, colonization itself became no longer sustainable, boring. The idea of Livingston's 3 C's, Christianity, commerce, and civilization, helping to eliminate, Arab slaving, those sort of arguments, no longer rang true, as they did before. And also, importantly, the anti-fascist propaganda on behalf of the Allies that said every people is equal, and every group should have self-determination, how do you then say, except for you guys, right? And so it was an inherent contradiction. Also, there was a rise of nationalism, that it became more commonly accepted, and more people were willing to sacrifice and put their lives on the line for self-determination, or freedom, shall we call it. And Africa's decolonization was actually part of a larger decolonization suite, where between 1945 and 1960, 1/4 of the world's population came out from underneath colonization. And these newly independent countries got into the UN and started clamoring for quick decolonization of the other countries. Also, we mentioned lessons from World War II, that wars likely result without free trade of raw materials. It's something I think contemporary thinkers should not forget very quickly. And free trade is necessarily at odds with colonization. And these ideas impacted the whole world simultaneously, right? Not just the US, not just Europe, not just Africa. And you also had the rise of the left in Europe, which also started pushing simultaneously for decolonization. And a lot of Africans actually fought on behalf of the British and the French in World War II. And they went back with ideas of democracy, of freedom, and the demythification or demystification of the Europeans and how powerful or not powerful. Okay, so also, within the context of African during colonization, civil society was weak, primarily because of discrimination against Africans under colonization. There was a 3-tiered economy. The Europeans owned most of the commanding heights of the economy, if you will. The plantations, the banks, import-exports, the top end of the military, the top end of the bureaucracies. Often you get, especially in East and Southern Asia, Levantines and Asians at the 2nd tier as shopkeepers especially. Excuse me. And Africans were often held at the lower ends. Often it was through what was called the color bar in South Africa, for example. Labor unions and political parties were only allowed to begin to form in former French and or then British, then French colonies. Not yet in the Belgians, forget the Portuguese. And so institutions take a while to develop, people take a while to develop these skills. And so civil society was relatively weak. There was no indigenous business class or bourgeoisie existing there. If some of your theory on democracy, the suggestion that you're very unlikely to have democracy without a business class, okay? So it really wasn't promising soil. And the first decolonization party that got in pressed for quick independence. So once one political party, so you have competing political parties, often based on ethno-regional logic, but once one came out and said, we're the independence party, pretty much everyone else joined them. It snowballed. The first party that seemed to have that as their primary aspiration. So And why would everyone else join them? Well, several reasons. Well, if it becomes the most important value, why create a rival party to help bring about the same outcome? Secondly, the colonialists themselves helped bring this about because they suggested they wanted a single entity with which they could negotiate. You see that, you know, in the Israeli-Palestinian issue as well. They want one face, one person to negotiate on behalf of the movement, even if the movement itself is very fragmented. And it helps, and once that person's named, it creates a power base for them to which other people are then attracted. And it had that bandwagon effect. And then winning the first pre-independence party usually guaranteed post-independence power. And then once the leaders were in place, then either de facto or de jure, they created one-party states. And weak parties were poorly rooted, easily targeted for coups d'etat. In fact, Benin and others suggest that weak states are especially prone to coups. And you saw a rash of coups throughout a lot of decolonization, the recently decolonized countries. So, what did this do? It set the ground for a relatively, historically speaking, rapid decolonization. The first party was a monopoly party or a super party. England and France left relatively quickly, having learned the lessons in Algeria, the British with the Mau Mau in Kenya, the Dutch in Indonesia. So instead of these independence movements rising and becoming fully formed between international pressure and onset of violence and the recognition the game was over once this happened, they left relatively quickly, and you had relatively inexperienced leaders taking the helm of these new countries. So I'll look at the clock or scoot along here. In terms of ideology, capitalism was seen as the enemy, as a handmaiden of capitalism. So a lot of the early, so imagine yourself, you're an African leader, and everyone says, hey, capitalism is the best. You're like, didn't they just kind of come and colonize us? And, also, there was a group of people called development economists, who especially got in Latin American cases, and whose normative value of helping third world countries develop thought that industrialization was the best way to go, and they felt that in the absence of having an African business class, it'd have to be done by the state, and so they should create an environment to shut the country off in a semi-autocratic way. Also, thinkers on the left in dependency theory argued that trade between advanced and less advanced countries had the net effect of pulling all the created wealth out of the country and will not lead to a deepening of its development. And then, you know, if you look at both China and the USSR in 1960, it looked like they were kind of doing okay, right? So Russia, circa 1860, was feudalism, lords, ladies, serfs. 1960s, one and two major superpowers. The Chinese were able to feed their own population. They dammed the Yalu River. We didn't know about, you know, Hunan province and kind of a lot of reports that come out about Ukraine. So there were a lot of stuff under the rug that was unknown, but at the time it seemed like a successful path to development. In Keynesian economics, where you had argument for a positive role for the state, especially during an economic downturn, not so much during the normal economy. And then the war economy of both the US and UK, you know, the ration by metals and sugar and rubber and so on, it seemed to have produced positive outcomes. So African nations adopted inward-oriented policies and pulled for national economic development and political control. And business leaders non-existent. So as a domestic constituency that might have opposed this, they didn't exist. Okay, and so inward-oriented policies were currency overvaluation, tariffs, usually three-tiered tariffs, the highest against manufactured goods, 30% or so against intermediate goods, and 0 against non-refined goods. Import substitution industrialization was a way not to invoke comparative advantage, but to move against it, or to shift it if it's successful. And agriculture was by and large ignored. At one point, Nigeria was the biggest agricultural exporter of sub-Saharan Africa. And 20 years later, not so much. So, you had weakened pro-colonial powers, the US and France, and I don't know if you know the Suez Crisis, but this was sort of like the Berlin Wall of the fall of British and French power. The ideas backing colonization were discredited. State-led development and fear of capitalism was very much in the environment. You had the rise of rise of anti-colonial. Both the U.S. and the USSR were against colonization, but for different reasons. Okay, and weak states emerging under this leadership needed external resources to stay in power. And they ended up bringing both majority political and economic power into their hands. In terms of economic policy, Kenya, Cote d'Ivoire, Malawi, Botswana were less inward-oriented, but they were slightly inward-oriented, just a lot less. Okay, second shift, and this will go faster, I promise. This was a relatively rapid move away from one-party, no-party states. In fact, between '89 and 1994, 29 sub-Saharan African countries had founding elections. Most took place in the single year of '93. 11 more had elections by '97. And by then, only a handful of countries had failed to hold multi-party elections. And by 2001, only Eritrea, Somalia, and Swaziland had not changed its constitution. Swaziland did change it, but not enough to be called. It's still a monarchy. Here's a graph showing founding elections. Okay. And so right around the time of the end of the Cold War, within a few years, started taking over. What were the political effects? A partial political liberalization in nearly every African country, all abandoned de jure one-party states, although Ethiopia seemed to have one again, but not by law. It's just everyone just really loves that party. Nearly all rewrote their constitution. Nearly all have held multi-party elections. I do not say they were all democracies. They run the gamut from free to not free, but most of them at least invoked window dressing of elections. In 2013, 9 were free, 23 partly free, 15 not free. 23 to 48 were called electoral democracies. That's a Freedom House thing. So even if you're not free, partly free, excuse me, but there's a chance the opposition could win, they put you in the electoral democracy, even if they probably won't win. Economic effects, there was a partial economic liberalization, most noticeably a move away from inward-oriented development policies, greater flows of international trade, region-wide increase in privatizations, rise in foreign direct investment, and those go hand in hand. Because most of the FDI, outside of what went to South Africa and 4 or 5 oil exporting countries, most of it was buying recently privatized telecommunications, water, and on and on and on. Increase in African membership in intergovernmental organization. Like most African countries were not first members in GATT, but by about '96, most had joined or then later joined the WTO. And then a rise in bilateral investment treaties. Investment treaties is one place where the Bretton Woods institution didn't have anything, and so this is sort of an independent, it's a worldwide event as well, but a lot of multinational corporations that want to invest in sub-Saharan Africa, given the past of nationalization, won't invest unless there's a bilateral investment treaty, which means the government will guarantee at least some of the assets that were invested will be returned. Here is a graph, this KOF globalization index, where the higher the number, the more economically globalized African countries are. And you see right around, kind of boosted up around 84, flattened, then right about 92 started going up. FDI inflows, there was more of a lag, but partially too. I think the African leagues reluctantly privatized, not willingly. It was only after international money started drying up, that selling off state assets became more thinkable, and about the time of 2000, we started zooming up. And in case you thought it was also South Africa, here's the one without South Africa. So why? Again, getting back to the idea of the geopolitical shift. Actually, and other shifts, the privatization swing actually began under Margaret Thatcher in preparation for European integration, and they started selling off a lot of their assets. Communist and socialist countries lost their champions. Once Deng Xiaoping announced black cat, white cat, I think it was '86. Black cat, white cat, doesn't matter. Capitalism, socialism, doesn't matter as long as it catches mice, right? The Soviet Union falling soon after the Berlin Wall. There was no straight up communist country, although China's kind of, but not really, on the Security Council, giving foreign aid, standing as a leader, as a pillar, as an exemplar. Also, a reinvigorated America pushed for even, so again, remember, free trade and democracy kind of got pushed down through the Cold War. Cold War went away, those went up. Also, the lessons from the geopolitical shift. State socialism, state-led, state socialism failed. Now, this isn't democratic socialism, although some people like to lump it in that basket, but I don't think anyone's saying Denmark's done, or Sweden's done, or Norway's done, right? But state-led, authoritarian state socialism seems to have been written off. No countries are communist. Cuba and North Korea sort of kind of hang on. Is Cuba still officially? Yeah, I think they are. Perceived state failures in Latin America and Africa. A lot of the research done by the World Bank and the IMF specifically tied slow growth and stagnant growth to policies. I know that's highly debated, but that was the conclusion. And there was an acceleration of conditionality, where the world, sometimes the United States would pressure the World Bank and the IMF not to go too hard on someone like Mobutu, because he was standing up to communism after all, right? But after he was no longer so useful for that, they turned the screws on him in terms of conditionality. And the World Bank actually closed their office in then Zaire, now the DRC. The rising legitimacy of democracy. And the World Bank even looking at good governance. When they were instituted, they were not allowed to look at the political regimes as a criterion whether or not they lend money, but good governance is sort of like a backdoor way of dealing with non-democratic regimes. And again, briefly, America has been, is leaving a position of preeminence. There's no, once Russia fell in the Warsaw Pact, who were America's real threats in terms of nation states, right? In fact, the former French minister, Hubert Védrine, called the U.S. hyperpuissance, a hyperpower. And according to Nye, Joseph Nye, who wrote Soft Power, no other state in modern history has had such military preponderance as the U.S., even compared to post-World War II. And we wanted to promote the goals that were at the heart of the Cold War. So, what helps promote democracy? There's some literature, diffusion matters. Huntington makes that argument in The Third Wave. There's a recent article in CPS called, The Neighborhood Matters. And prior to the end of the Cold War, a lot of the world was in part of what Huntington called the Third Wave. And in fact, right at his book got published right before this, and he was wondering, will this third wave continue? And with the fall of the Berlin Wall, a whole lot zoomed into Eastern Europe. Okay? In '74, 25% of the countries were free, 36 by '89, and by 2000, 45%. So it seems to be, almost, in fact, political scientists sort of get back to the idea of democracy being inevitable, although that's sort of on the skids a little bit now. And this accelerated with the end of the Cold War. So, Fukuyama, in fact, declared, he wrote a book, somewhat famously, The End of History. And then not only ideas as themselves, but ideas attached to international power matter, I argue. And in 1990, George Bush Sr., Douglas Hurd, the Foreign Minister of England, and Francois Mitterrand all announced that the official development aid going to third world countries will be linked to political liberalization. Now, they didn't say democracy, but they said political liberalization. And that meant electoral democracies. And then the Maastricht Treaty also listed democracy as a key criteria for the dispensation of ODA. And, you know, bilateral, multilateral aid out of Europe is 50% of all African aid. And here's inflation-adjusted aid going. So there was a slight tip down right after the end of the Cold War, but it accelerated, especially after 2001 with 9/11. Also, capitalism seems to have been off the ropes, at least until recently. The rise of globalization and foreign direct investment worldwide. You know, in a lot of Latin America, so I remember it used to be when I was in grad school, people were reading that sending foreign direct investment was bad for third world countries, and then more recent was like the advanced countries need to send more FDI. So it almost has shifted. There was a rising legitimacy of multinational corporation. Countries seeking aid, investment, and trade no longer had the USSR, by the way, although China is sort of rising, but that's sort of a special case. FDI was rising worldwide. Well, in fact, part of the reason FDI, remember that lag I showed you between the end of the Cold War and when it started taking off in Africa? Most of it was going to East Asia, right? A lot of it was going to Hungary, to Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, the Czech Republic, or Czechoslovakia for a while, then it broke apart. So a lot of people were investing in Poland. So a lot of people weren't taking bets on Africa right away, actually. But it came eventually. Okay, and again, there was certain learning. You could be seen as conclusions and or propaganda, depending on your perspective, that state-led socialism hadn't worked. And often people took the Knicks as evidence for capitalism, although Wade has a nice book called Governing the Market. So it was actually, you know, state-led, but it was state-led exporting, right? And when it was working, they called it capitalism, and after 97, they said, well, the problem was the state. They didn't see the state before 97. Okay, so, but, you know, I think capitalism had a little sheen off the apple, taken off in 97, and a whole lot in 08. Okay, so domestically, and here I mean regionally domestically, I'm not talking about a particular country, but the sub-region, most African systems were based on the patrimonial logic. Again, the idea of patronage, that support comes in return for access to state resources. Complete economic liberalization puts that all in jeopardy, right? And complete political liberalization, you know, they can vote you out, and a lot of the people that used to be, oh, you can't. Okay, thank you. So a lot of the people in power could be voted out and find themselves in prisons. That may not be so good. And they were often the ones in charge of making the reforms themselves. So the African elite responsible for reform had some self-interest in not doing this. So I think the best way to think about this is this, oh no, it's not right there. So they wanted to do the least amount of reforms and still have international money flow, right? If it wasn't quite enough to do a little bit more, then the international money would flow again, and then they'd stay with that partial liberalization. Yeah, I know right there. So the international commitment to elections and apparent democracy more than real democracy, because then again, you know, how far do you take this, right? But again, it's not like Africa created this rich civil society and entrepreneurial business class under authoritarian state-dominated societies. And the parties are based more on patronage than ideology. But if you push them too far, you can have a Somalia. So, summing up, there were two massive overhauls in the political and economic systems. The nature of the ideas, the self-interest of the actors, and the way it played out seems to align logically and in a covariant sense, if you will. I just said that. This is like a case illustrative. There was a scholar I read in grad school called Borovich, and he would take one international shock and trace it out through a series of countries and try to show their similarities or view that shock. And I tried to do a similar thing here. In the first period, leaders had greater autonomy than they do now, in part because of Cold War. What really mattered is that they stayed in a relative Cold War category. But in the second period, democratic reform and actually donor fatigue, especially with corruption and developmental money not leading to development, it was also part of this as well. Okay? Although, one of the nice things, Africa's actually been growing. And by 1990, in the 80s it came up a little bit, and it really took up the 1990s, and they passed Asian countries as an average. Okay, so what's next? So if this logic's correct, then this partial liberalization, economically and politically, should mostly stay in place until unless there's another rapid geopolitical shift. Or there could be a slow undermining of this if there's a drift on the part of those leading international power that move away from keeping pressure on African elites to maintain these, let's call them institutions of accountability. Will the war on terrorism sort of do that? Many have suggested that's true for Ethiopia. Ethiopia receives the lion's share of aid now from the United States, both military and economic. They're in the Horn of Africa, and the current government sees itself very much as an ally on the war on terrorism. But they also get Chinese aid. They're diversifying their portfolio. Many people suggest that our rise in China is bad for democracy because they'll start offering aid that's not connected to these things, and that countries might backslide. Although, my first response is I don't think this is all or nothing. So if you can get money from China and Germany and England and France, and you kind of have showcase elections anyhow, why get rid of the showcase? What do you really gain? Now, China won't walk away from you, but the others might, right? But it does give some ideological cover. In fact, the Ethiopians for the past 5 years or so have been talking about following the Chinese model of development. However, some of the people that did ride this wave had been in the opposition for years, don't want to see other people in power, might want to keep elections going. This might be their way of staying in power. Okay, so absent a war or collapse of, now I wrote this book also before Trump got elected, and I have no idea what's going to happen. And I don't know if he will single-handedly help undermine the international liberal order, but he ain't helping. Talk about NATO reaching its end. I don't know. Remember World War I and World War II. But will this just be a detour, sideshow, interregnum? What's commitment to the South? And I'll end there and take questions if you have any.
Thanks, Dr. Quinn. We have lots of time for questions. Do you want to take your own questions?
Sure.
Is that fine?
Yeah, you don't have to say it. Yeah.
Okay.
I was going to ask what kind of, or I guess like, what do you think the most important resources have been in developing Africa and those kind of institutions?
You mean developing more democratic institutions, or the institutions in general, or?
Mostly like what do you think has been, I guess most, I can't think of the word I'm thinking for, most important to the African institutions to continue to showcase this kind of democracy? Like what is it that they want to do the most?
John Harbison wrote a nice piece called Externally Assisted Democratization, which I cite in there, and he suggests that, not unlike a lot of people in this country suggesting most people prefer democracy, but you need a space for those people to be able to vote, to protest, articulate their voice, and if there's international pressure that keeps those people from being put in prison or being beaten up, then they have more space that civil society can grow, and it actually makes that civil society potentially more powerful. But real crackdowns have real impacts on civil society. I remember Sklar one time at a conference saying, well, what is the strength of a civil society in Nigeria the day after a coup? It's much, much lower. And so to the degree that you keep the people in the barracks and the politicians in whatever house they are, and that you put pressure or cut aid when important opposition members are jailed, that might help it. But eventually, in the long term, it has to grow there itself. And that people have to draw political, social, and economic resources from African soil to strengthen African democracy. But this could, international community could be like an umbrella for a while, right? But for a while, it was an anti-umbrella. If it was, because a lot of military aid went to a lot of developing countries, it actually kept a small group of people who may not have been in power without foreign aid in power for quite a while.
Your thoughts on the recent situation in the Gambia and the switch from the longtime dictator to a democratically elected government, and how that kind of came about, not through U.S. leadership, but from pressure from within Africa for the
Yeah, no, that's great. The case of Gambia, you know, is one of the three that kept multi-party democracy for most of the Cold War period. Then they made a tragic mistake. They allowed an army to form, and the army to get over the democracy. The Senegal, under Macky, played a key role. They were going to send troops in. And part of it, too, was a backing by ECOWAS, it's the Economic Community of West African States, that there are economic regional integration groups, communities, they're called RACs, but they also often have political and security elements. So ECOWAS sent ECOMOG to Liberia to help stabilize it during, you know, the Diamond Wars, shall we call them. And they encouraged Senegal to play a similar role because the Barrow, the recently elected person in the Gambia, so they actually held elections, and surprise, the opposition won, but the president wasn't going to acknowledge the result. But once you allow an election and someone else won, then the rest of the community can sort of step up, right? And so, like Kabila in Zaire, DRC, excuse me, I'll make that mistake a lot when I lived there in Zaire. He hasn't allowed elections, so no one else has won who can claim the throne on that, metaphorically throne. So I think it's very good to the degree that the African Union has, it moved away from the African Organization of Unity to the African Union, and one of the planks is they will not recognize unconstitutionally governments that came about extra-constitutional. And so the Gambia wouldn't have been recognized as the African Union, and symbolically that matters, and Senegalese troops were mounting on the border. They were going to go in. Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about South Africa and how their responses to global shifts were maybe different from the weaker states?
You know, So South Africa, pre-1990, and Namibia, prior to that, Southwest Africa, don't get a lot of work in the book. In part because this is, I'm sort of painting with a real thick brush. And a broad brush, I'm making region-wide generalizations. That means some paint's going to be on the floor, and not every example is going to be quite right. But the South African case didn't fit at all. It didn't have majority rule until Mandela came out in the early 1990s. It was run by a minority white group from colonization on. And although the Brits won the Anglo-Boer War of 1899 to 1901, the South Africans won the peace. And it transferred to the white colonial minority. So they don't fit a lot of these generalizations and these trends. However, they are more fitting these trends. And I see Zuma, unfortunately, as a more average African leader that we might have seen 20 or 30 years ago. Although it's still in a democracy, and he's still curtailed. But he's spending millions and millions of dollars on his houses, and anyone investigating him gets sacked. It's a rise of populism that's a bit threatening. Hopefully, the ANC might split, and I'm not against the ANC, but I think it's healthier for democracies to have parties contest power than just have one have it all the time. Yeah.
What country would you say has been the most successful, I guess, in terms of economic stability and political stability since the end of the Cold War?
Well, a lot of people point to Ethiopia economically, not politically. In fact, when Clinton made his tour of Africa, he talked about the new leaders. It was Museveni in Uganda, it was Meles in Uganda, it was Zenawi of Eritrea, and Rawlings of Ghana. And these are all people that came to power by the barrel of the gun. But once they get in place, they put in policies that were consistent with the recommendations of the World Bank, and they started to grow. Now, Rawlings, to his credit, sort of looked around the world and said, hey, maybe this democracy is a good thing. And they've had a series of elections and actually have alternated power. South Africa is still technically in Botswana. Botswana is the one example most people march out. They've been stable. I think there's a new movie coming out about the first president of Botswana. He married a British woman, and he wasn't actually allowed to return to his country by the Brits unless he forswore his crown. He was the heir apparent of the Botswana kingdom. Then he went on to become the first president. But from my perspective, Botswana they nationalized their diamonds by up to 50%. And so my first book, I make an argument that countries in sub-Saharan Africa shouldn't own a majority control of diamonds or oil, but right up to 50% might make sense, because I don't necessarily trust multinational corporations either. I think people with too much power can't be trusted. And so it created a mutual veto and a mutual check. And so the government could see the books, corporations could see the books, corporations had a say in who the accountants were. And like in Nigeria, the national oil company, they just run a parallel set of books. And anyone who tries to look at them gets sacked. Yeah.
Speaking of diamonds and oil, could you talk a little bit about how rents play into this whole situation?
Right. A whole lot of people who do political economy of sub-Saharan Africa discuss a neo-patrimonial system whereby political power is distributed through the distribution of rents. So think of Tammany Hall or maybe even the Daily Machine in Chicago. And what it tends to emerge is a one-party system. So if you look at major cities historically where there were these machines, you never saw a change in political party, right? And anyone that would openly vote for the other party, they would never get another city contract. Their friends would lose their jobs at the city. And there's a whole lot of that still going on in sub-Saharan Africa. But there's less of it. Now, I would say that it's worse in countries where the state owns most of, more than 50% of the stock in any one company, because again, they can name the accountants. They can like keep double books. The firewalls, you know, it's sort of like Truman, yes, we're run by the state, but we're semi-autonomous, right? And so if you can create mines, or like Norway does, a semi-autonomous functioning body that does what's in the best interest of the sector, and then tax it, instead of just trying to take its profits directly to the people, then it can work out. But you know, even if you're going like Zambia, for example, in '69 nationalized their copper under the Mulungushi Accords, and so all of a sudden, the state owns copper, and now someone somewhere could say, well, we want a school here. They can go to the copper company and take the money for the school. And I'm in favor of schools, don't get me wrong, but what if they needed that to like rebuild or maintain the shafts or the mines? It undoes the internal logic of the management of the company. So they should be semi-autonomous, and then just tax them in a predictable way. Yeah.
So do you, I know you said you're painting with a broad brush
I am.
in this book, so, but I just wondered if there were certain countries that kept cropping up over and over again as case studies or not,
I might have picked and chosen ones that fit my cases. I can't say they all fit. Zimbabwe seems to be standing up against the international community. In fact, I just heard an NPR story about Zimbabwe on the way over. And, but they're doing so at their own peril. And ZANU-PF, their inflation's out of control. They're under American sanctions. They're under British sanctions. So they're maintaining their one-party system. Technically they allowed a second party, but they keep beating up the opposition, right? And anyone that votes for the other party, if they find out, they're fired from their jobs. And so it's an open secret of the coercion. So they're still doing it, but I think they've moved. It's almost more like a North Korean case, that it's fear and the security system is keeping them in place more than patronage, because they've sort of destroyed the underlying vibrant economy. Yeah.
In my admittedly short time in Africa, I noticed that there was a very strong tribal component or background to their politics. And
Sure.
being in Kenya, it about destroyed the country 10 years ago or so, when
Sure.
they had a
Mwai
contested
Kibaki.
election. And their political parties seem to be largely tribal-based, not ideological-based, which would make democracy almost seem like not a natural fit for these countries.
Right.
And if they gradually gravitate towards one-party systems, are they not actually trying to reinstate political systems that are more tribal in nature, which would be a better fit for them?
Right. But what is that tribe trying to do? Those are the venues through which the resources are being distributed. And so, in a way, they're non-ideological still, but they're a cohesive unit that's trying to extract resources from the state. And one of the potential problems with democracy in sub-Saharan Africa, it happened in the 60s, it happened now, is that the Mansur Olson in political science talks about collective action costs. And it's actually hard to build a political party from scratch. So when all of a sudden it's like go and compete, societies often start with pre-existing institutions and build on those. And those were traditional elites very often. They tended, in the early period, they tended not to fare well because they could make strong allegiances locally but not nationally. But hopefully some pan-ethnic parties could emerge. But yes, in the short term, there are tremendous dislocations.
It just seems like putting democracy on that is just asking for tribal warfare in a sense.
Well, possibly, especially if the political elites are playing their cards that way. And I also think that part of it too, these are seeds sown by Arab Moi, the former president. And then so he was pressured by the international community to have elections. And so what he would do is he allowed elections, and his group was from the West, called the Kalenjin group. Some people even dispute whether it's an ethnicity or not, but it was like a collection of groups. And what he did was he actually hired people to go to other ethnic groups and attack them. And so the Luo and the Kikuyu would have hired people from Moi attack them, and the Kikuyu would blame the Luo would blame the Kikuyu, and on and on. And that is partly artificial, but it was there to take advantage of. So I can't say you are incorrect. If politics become seen primarily as zero-sum, they get the edge. And I don't think it has to be that way, but I know it can be. And I know in like Cote d'Ivoire, when Bédier took over from Houphouët-Boigny, one of the first things he did was disenfranchise the North and said, you aren't Cote d'Ivoirians. And they passed a law that you had to prove that your grandparents were Cote d'Ivoirian. And this was primarily to keep a guy named Ouattara from running against them. And so it created a lot of violence because it was considered unfair, as well as aimed at the Muslim North. And in Zambia, Kenneth Kaunda, who ran Zambia for most of the independence period, the Zambians, after he lost the election, passed a law saying that both your grandparents had to be from Zambia, so he himself couldn't run for the election. And more importantly, his kids couldn't run. And so there were sometimes parties create restrictions on who can vote so they can get power, even in Africa. But yes, there's conflict. But hopefully democracy manages conflict reasonably well. And, but not all.
So I've always heard that under the Bush administration, under W, from 2000, 2008, or 2001 to 08, we saw lots of aid for Africa. We saw an improvement in Africa. Was this aid contingent upon these political liberalization developments? And if it was, did we see success toward building civil society? Do we see success from 01 to 08 because of America's push toward this continued effort? I mean, this would fit your narrative then, right?
Sure. I would say that it's both aid and fear of loss of aid.
Right, sure.
That motivates this.
Sure.
And that losing aid is probably more, the loss of the aid would be catastrophic to whoever it happened to, much more than the gaining of the aid would go to them.
Okay.
But also for some African countries, especially if they've been under structural adjustment conditionality, because there's a whole lot more like to all these linkages that hard to even raise. But so there was HIPC for the highly indebted countries that if they stayed under the equivalent of structural adjustment for 3 years or more, they could actually have their debt written down. And according to the original IMF and World Bank's charters, they weren't allowed to forgive debt. Because they were afraid to lose the principal, then they couldn't lend it to other countries. But then under NDR and HIPC, that changed. So a lot of countries went from having debt-to-export ratios of 70, 80% down to 15, 20%. So those were big successes. And they also had to have poverty amelioration programs. And they had to submit to the World Bank on paper what they were going to do to help the poorest of the poor. Because the presumption is this debt's being forgiven, so instead of this money going abroad, it can go stay domestically and help alleviate poverty. There was also a commodities boom as well. Both China and India started growing. And most of Africa's exports were being consumed by these growing countries, and Europe was growing. And this was doing pretty well until 2008. Some countries are still growing, but they're growing at a less rapid rate. But some of it too, your statistician, this is regression to the mean, that they had such bad policies for so long. It's like after a war, you're going to see countries grow like Rwanda, like Uganda, like Ethiopia. They had long internal domestic conflicts where Ethiopia and Angola used to be the major coffee exporters, and they kind of disappeared as coffee exporters. And it takes 7 years to grow a coffee tree and get your first harvest, and to bring all these things back online takes a while. But I think American aid helped. A lot of what USAID does is civil society. They try to put money into civil society. There's a mixed literature on whether it works or not. I think its biggest potential help is, especially in places like Tanzania, where 80% of government revenues is aid. Any significant cutback would just decimate the government. Yeah. Paul.
You and I talked a little bit before about the importance of leadership.
Sure.
I'll pursue that a little bit. First, the setup that tonight you said that you assume leaders are rational. They want to stay in power and
sure.
part of that rationality. So those cases where you see success, those cases where you see maybe failure moving towards liberalization, is that because outside forces have shaped incentives for them to make choices, or is something else going? Maybe are there different leaders that make different choices about the future of their country?
It was a simplifying assumption to apply to a set of cases where there would be a variance around it. But by and large, a lot of the leaders that emerged in sub-Saharan Africa, especially under the Cold War period, came out of the military and came from regions of the country where they had been marginalized, and it was rare that a leader in Africa was raised with the expectation that rule. Botswana would be one exception. Houphouët-Boigny wasn't raised that way, but he was a large cocoa producer. And so he put into, many people argue, Jennifer Widener in particular, argue that Cote d'Ivoire followed rational economic policies because the business class, the bourgeoisie business class, actually owned agriculture. And so they put into places that policies that advantage agriculture. The same could be argued for Kenya in the early Kenyatta years. Kenyatta and his family and his group all had farming interests. And Mike Lofty makes that argument that when the political elite owned the agricultural resources, they tended to put them into place. Whereas Nkrumah, out of the military, was a socialist, and I think he was a believer, and they moved away from agriculture and put into place systems where there was no economic accountability through the market, no economic accountability to owners, and no political accountability to voters. And they tended towards a deepening of authoritarianism. Nyerere of Tanzania, I think, meant well, but it didn't grow very well. But it was one of the better places. Other questions?
In the kind of like perspective of considering dependency theory,
Sure.
Do you believe that without capitalism and the colonialized groups that you were talking about earlier,
Sure.
That developing nations would, sorry, so do you believe that without capitalism within these colonized groups, that developing nations would not, to this day, still so heavily depend on free trade to sustain their state's economic systems?
Well, in international relations, there's a term called interdependence. And so you know, if trade were cut off tomorrow by, I don't know, someone decided they want to pull out of the World Trade Organization or NAFTA or something, only about 15%, well, historically it's 15%. I think we're up to about 25% of our economy is governed by free trade, so it'd be a bit of a shock. But you could say we're dependent on trade or we're interdependent because other countries would be hurt as well, right? And so I'm not a big, the whole dependency theory, I think starts with a grain of truth but draws too wide a berth of conclusions. And I'm not sure, because the other thing too is like, what are the counterfactuals? So, you know, how did England become capitalistic? Well, it sort of started with the enclosure movement, right? And the peasants weren't allowed to get firewood, or they weren't allowed to hunt the deer, if you know your Ivanhoe or Robin Hood, right? The opening scene, that kid is hunting the deer, and the king's men are chasing him down, and Ivanhoe saves them, if you know the book or the movie. And it began with the enclosure movement, and then capitalism slowly grew. And so a lot of people looking at sub-Saharan Africa say, Africa tried to kickstart its development at much lower levels of education, much lower levels of per capita GDP than Europe. And also Europe took a longer period of time. And so, you know, Europe's development into capitalism is marked in 50 to 100 years, whereas we were expecting Africa from 1960, right, to 50 years later, sort of have vibrant economies. And, you know, even Russia, you know, when they liberated the serfs, and, you know, and Peter the Great tried to institute industrialization at the beginning, but you still had a very limited working class by the time Lenin took over, right? So Gordon Hyde, there's a guy named Gordon Hayden. He wrote a book called No Shortcut to Progress. And this stuff just takes a while, I think. And, you know, transferring technology, I mean, you get silos where you can translate technology, but a lot of rapid change can be disruptive if it's too fast, right? So I think however fast development takes place, I think the citizens of that polity ought to have due process to their rights. And even if they're not rich, they should hold their government to account and have as many opportunities as can be afforded by that society. And I think oftentimes, you know, we shouldn't think of human beings as means to an ends, and Immanuel Kant would suggest that, you know, too rapid of development, you end up chewing up whole generations of people. They become the sacrifice for the next generation. And if they're doing it willingly, that's one thing. But like the Chinese and Hunan and the Ukrainians and the kulaks, I don't think they did it so willingly. But yet, China and Russia made huge strides forward. So, I think capitalism is dynamic, but if you allow monopolies, if you don't regulate it, if those people aren't held to account, they'll make real bad choices. They'll misuse their power. And I feel the same way about political leaders, military leaders, fill-in-the-blank leaders, if they're not held to account.
Yeah, I just want to actually take at least a subtle disagreement with you here when you mentioned South Africa as a failed case here. At least.
Did I say that?
Well, you said it didn't fit.
Yes.
At least from the larger perspective, you know, they gave up nukes in 1990. Apartheid ends in 1994.
Okay, they didn't fit in 45. They fit better post World War II.
Well, they fit better, I think, the post Cold War shock.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So I would fit. So I guess you're saying, well, South Africa doesn't fit. I thought you said, well,
it fits better in the second period.
For sure. Yeah.
It doesn't fit so well in the first period.
Okay. Yeah.
In fact, they stood up to international pressure.
Yeah.
Although they were supported by the United States. Reagan was a full supporter of South Africa because of Cold War logic. So in some ways they do fit.
But as soon as the shock of Cold War ends, they lose the aid, they lose the support.
Right. And importantly, they were losing the war against Angola. Jerry Bender makes that argument that the South African Defense Force and South African Air Force really started facing significant losses when the Cuban mercenaries, when they met the Cuban mercenaries in Angola. And then the South African Defense Force actually went to the political elites and said, we have to end apartheid. We can't win this militarily. You know, this has to end in a different way, or it's not going to end well. So it's actually, their military was more progressive than their politicians.